if you were trying to drive anywhere in Zagreb Monday afternoon, you probably had a little bit of trouble. Over 250,000 people flooded the streets to welcome back the Croatian national football team after the World Cup finals. It's phenomena like these that we think demonstrate the power of sports to unite and define the community. With that, I'll do a couple of things in this speech. First, I'll provide our 3-point model. Then I'll provide our first 2 arguments. First, that sports are public goods that ought to be community owned. And second, that community ownership protects community resources and betters community relations. Our second speaker will provide our third argument. First, on our model. We think sports clubs are non-profit in our world. This means revenue from ticket sales and merchandise would be reinvested back into the team instead of going into owners' private pockets. Secondly, residents of the city and in the surrounding area of a team's place of origin will be able to buy shares in the team's stock. We would also support a cap on shares to make sure that no one person or small group of people are able to have a disproportionate number of shares and disproportionate power. Our third point under this is that citizens who buy stock under our model would have voting rights over major long-term team decisions. This looks like moving locations, upgrading stadiums, ticket prices, and elections on new leadership. What this voting power does not include, however, are day-to-day sports management questions, like which players to draft or what plays to make. We think team managers and coaches hired by the board of directors would still have authority over actual competition. These look like teams like FC Barcelona and the Green Bay Packers. With that, I'll go on to our stance for this round. We think the nature of sports is so impactful and an intrinsic part of the community that it requires community control. Our stance is not that local communities need sports teams, rather they would just own existing teams. We think that the team's impact on the community should be the primary focus for today's round because it is the community that has the most to gain or lose in the presence or absence of a sports team. Our first argument is that on principle, sports teams are public goods that should be controlled by communities. Our first point under this is that sports teams provide significant social benefits, but they still impose social costs and thus warrant community control. In general, when something is extremely important and its use imposes significant costs on individuals, we prefer things like government ownership because we want elected representatives rather than private actors to decide how to absorb or distribute those costs. This is why we have governments and not corporations set tax rates, for example. Similarly, we think private sports teams have a massive impact on the public, but the individuals in the community do not always consent to the costs that are associated with it. Stadiums and fields, for example, take up a lot of space, and the construction and location of these venues displaces residents to a large degree. For example, to build Tottenham Hotspur football stadium, many local homes would have to be demolished and displaced in order to make that happen. We think communities are much better placed to make decisions about these trade-offs with minimal impact to residents and businesses compared to private actors. Second point under this argument, because sports teams have a unique role in identity formation, they should be publicly owned. Sports shape social culture in a multitude of ways. First, the sports club serves as a point of congregation and a clear sense of identity for the community. People of all genders, races, education levels, religious backgrounds are all able to come together over sports, like we saw in Zagreb with the Croatian football team. Secondly, we think clubs enhance rivalries, which create loyalties within communities, both within each other and loyalties to the team. Third, organizations like sports are unique in that they are powerful in shaping communal identity and they claim to represent the community. So they should be accountable to the community when they're doing these actions. We don't think one fringe billionaire should be able to have all of the control. Otherwise, individuals are simply governed by private interests and not themselves. Our second argument is that community ownership better protects community resources and promotes community relations. But first,
if sports is so integral to the community, then why historically have most community teams been sold off voluntarily?
We think that this is not necessarily the heart of this debate. We're simply saying that community ownership is a good thing. We think there are wide factors that perhaps you could explain to us. We think communities have a very direct tie to the teams, and this incentive would not exist on our side of the house. Our second argument explains this further, about how community ownership preserves local resources for the community. Private teams are well known for extorting cities for money. Billionaires and owners have very little loyalty to a particular city because they don't have to care about the city to get money out of them. It's because owners know they can get whatever they want by threatening to leave. This looks like cities being forced to give up stadium subsidies that are much higher than the cost of education within their cities without community consent. This also looks like things like favorable tax breaks to teams as well. We saw this happen in New York, for example. Direct and indirect subsidies to 3 major New York stadiums, Yankee Stadium, Citi Field, and the Barclays Center cost $867 million, while universal pre-K in the city would have only costed roughly $500 million. When these decisions about prioritizing sports over things like education are made by private actors, we think that harms the community much more. We think community-owned teams have a unique obligation to conserve public resources, and they're thus more likely to balance support for sports versus other priorities like community well-being. Ultimately, when cities don't capitulate to owners' demands, they lose the teams after spending millions of dollars on them. This looks like the Brooklyn Dodgers moving to LA, Clydebank FC moving to Wakefield, and the Sydney Swans moving to South Melbourne. We are principally opposed to that on our side of the house. Our second point under this is that local ownership of teams builds social capital and strengthens the community network. We think community-owned teams are much more likely to devote their resources to community efforts, like funding youth outreach programs, for example. It's because these teams are governed by local community members who directly benefit from these policies. So they are more likely to want community outreach. This is the incentive as to why they want to do this. This looks like FC Barcelona's Football Net program, which teaches kids about teamwork and perseverance through sport. It reaches over 30,000 kids in Catalonia alone, and especially low-income individuals, and it's all free of charge. Compare that to Arsenal Sports Camp, which would cost you $1,600 a week. And that money goes into the hands of owner Stan Kroenke, not the community, because they're privately owned. Next point under this argument is that community ownership results in a greater buy-in into sports themselves. The community is much more likely to do things like volunteer for teams because they've literally invested in the team. We think the buy-in is empirically larger for community-owned teams, like we see with the Green Bay Packers, for example. We see volunteers are very willing to work concessions to the point where they're also willing to shovel snow in freezing temperatures to help out the team. It is this devotion to the team that we think is unique to community ownership because they're the ones that have this connection that private teams don't, because owners don't make the effort to connect with the community. In contrast, the Dallas Cowboys are a privately owned team. And if the owner, Jerry Jones, asked for volunteers, he'd be laughed at because the people know that the volunteer work they do only saves Jerry Jones a little bit of money and doesn't go back into the community. We think that additionally, ticket prices are much more likely to become decreased on our side of the house. It's because private investors are profit motivated, so they run sports like a business. This increases ticket price. This means increased ticket prices and selling elite luxury boxes for money. In contrast, community members have voting power, and they want to attend sporting games, so they have an incentive to keep ticket prices low and make games as accessible as possible to the large majority of the community. We think that sports have value because they foster civil society. They create networks of people that foster cooperation, common understanding, and the fulfillment of the human need for interaction. Thus, we are very proud to propose.
The real world is not some Marxist fantasy land. Don't let side propositions overly romanticize notion of sport disguise the fact that professional sports teams require huge amounts of money and the rich individuals and corporations we defend give this money. We think that this is reflective of the fact that in history, many community-owned teams voluntarily sold those teams off in order to protect the sustainability of the sport. What is our stance? 1, we support things like status quo, where private individuals or corporations should be allowed to own teams. 2, we think communities can still own teams or buy into shares if individual people want to own it. We don't think we need to require them to do so. 2 arguments at first speaker. 1, why our policy is necessary to even have a sizable sports industry, and 2, why corporations are more effective at keeping sports competitive. My second speaker will engage with the best case scenario side proposition, where even if they can prove these 2 things are available on their side, why they increase rampant inequality and worse competitiveness. They have, in terms of rebuttal, they give you 2 main ideas. Firstly, this principled idea about the public good of sports, and secondly, the last 2 arguments can be reduced to the idea about how private corporations exploit communities while community ownership benefits. First, the response to the idea of sport being a public good. Look, Mr. Speaker, these aren't mutually exclusive ideas. You can have a public good and still earn profit as well. We see this in things like electricity, which is clearly a public good, but many countries privatize electricity because they realize they can serve that public good while at the same time doing it more efficiently. That's what my argument is going to show you. No, thank you. But even if they can show you some social costs, there are enormous social benefits, like the tourism, like the merchandising, like the increased publicity of your city. No, thank you. But we think they're principally inconsistent because they're capping shares anyway, so their whole democratic principle is slightly undermined at the point when they're not actually including the whole community. And furthermore, no thank you, we think their view of fans is too parochial. FC Barcelona, Arsenal, the Green Bay Packers have global backing. We think they reduce the incentive of these people, no thank you, to cater to the global community. Lastly, in terms of harms, look, there's a social license to operate that most teams need to respond to because it affects the viability of the team when the local people don't support them if they hurt them. That's their entire principal case dealt with. Their second and third arguments, no thank you, is about exploitation of communities and subsidies to sports. We think this is an example of arguing by example. They've shown you singular instances without showing why this is systemically true. We show you that structurally, no thank you, there is very little incentive to do these abuses because because people are likely to lose profit by the anger because people no longer buy. We give you the example of the Minnesota Timberwolves because when the Lakers left Minneapolis, the Minnesota Timberwolves came in. This shows you they don't have the same grip they want to talk to you about. No thank you. Their last argument was about social outreach. I will rebut this all throughout my case. It will be completely integrated. Moving on to my first argument about why this is necessary. We think first layer of analysis here, there's massive funding that professional sports teams require. Things like paying player salaries, coaching salaries, travel, training and health, maintenance of stadiums, marketing and advertising, as well as licensing fees for the names you use. We think in general, corporations or rich individuals are much better able to absorb these costs because of the enormous resources they have relative to most communities. But on the second level, no thank you, we think that owning professional sports is an extremely risky business that demands corporate ownership as a safeguard because they can absorb losses due to buffer capital of credit. 4 points of analysis here. No. First, corporations or rich people have excess money to invest and are in it for the long haul, as opposed to teams who respond to short-term incentives. So in short losses, like in the past, they sold off these teams anyway. Secondly, in terms of financial hardship or recession, these corporations, no thank you, or rich individuals have better ability to access credit or bridge loans because of their reputation with banks. No. Thirdly, this is also directly responsive to their idea about how individuals will volunteer. We think individuals will deprioritize sports if recession or financial hardships means they have to prioritize other aspects of their life, and they will cut their losses. We have several examples. In 2016, in the English Premier League, 7 clubs ran a loss which was cross-subsidized by profits from other industries that their owners had. What is going to happen on their side? We don't think they can reasonably expect people to take money out of their pension funds, their health insurance costs, and other costs they have to fund sports teams. Or in basketball, in 2008, when the Detroit Pistons of the Cleveland Cavaliers reached the Eastern Conference Finals, even if those cities were hardest hit by recession, because on our side, corporate owners were able to funnel money to be off this. We think if they want to have a principle about the integrity of sport, no thank you, the sustainability of the sport is most important in this debate. We think these 3 layers already show why it's less sustainable, because the potential money is redirected to other things that people need to prioritize. This hurts the team, but also creates a vicious cycle of deprioritization, because at this point where the teams start performing worse, there is less incentive for these volunteers to buy into that team and buy into that identity. So if that's the thing they wanted to put out in terms of social outreach, that hurts them as well. On the comparative, corporations have safety nets or investors come to save the teams. That doesn't happen on their side. No thank you. Those 3 layers already show you why their side is not sustainable. But preemptively, we want to make a distinction between things like sponsors and owners, because we recognize that side proposition can claim things like sponsors as well. The first thing we say is that owners invest stimulus money in the team, whereas sponsors do not. This stimulus money is important in times where you need to do things like renovation or buying new players after your team has stagnated. Sponsors, on the other hand, don't do this. They already follow individual players who they think will bring brand value to their capital. But even if side proposition is able to prove, no thank you, that they do invest in teams, they only invest in the strongest teams, meaning that the most weak teams will be forced to disband. On our side, communities are still able to have ownership, but if they fail, they can be saved by private owners with the examples we gave you. No thank you. The last layer about how their side is prone to populist decision-making, irrational, unmeritocratic decision-making. Considering the community is good, but we showed you why there are significant incentives to do that, and significant incentives to care for the community because of their social license to operate, because otherwise their viability will be affected by the anger of that community, by the unwillingness to opt into that culture of the team, by the unwillingness to buy merchandise. After this argument, how does this look like? This looks like ticket prices. Look, we think ticket prices sometimes are necessary to be raised to have money for the team. Or things like biases and racism. We give you the example of Chelsea, where fans wanted to fire Arvin Grant even after they had a 16-game unbeaten record. This didn't happen because they were privately owned and they were able to resist these biases. The takeaway is simple. If their whole idea is about sport and exploitation, we think their value only stands if sports are sustainable. We show that on our side. Moving on to the second argument about effectiveness, but before that go.
Are there any instances in which you would support community ownership of anything, and if so, what conditions?
Look, we told you in our model, community people in the community can still own things. They can't point to single instances. It is their majority burden to prove that in the majority of instances when they're required, they're able to have a beneficial environment. The second argument about effectiveness. The first layer I want to talk about is talent attraction. Look, we're not saying that overnight the talent and competitiveness is going to fall. But we're going to say in the long run, younger players who have talent are not likely to pursue this sport to the highest levels. Why? Because in the propositions world, there's less people pursuing sports because the lower salary ranges no longer outweigh the opportunity cost. No, thank you. This looks like Barcelona, who has under 12 football teams, which they feed into their upper levels. People are no longer likely to make this trade-off because it takes away important things like education, where if they don't make the final team, that's a huge loss on their life. We think they fundamentally harm attraction. But secondly, in terms of scouting, and this directly responds to the idea about social outreach, because we think teams are likely to invest in social outreach, to try and scout for talent, to try and make people more interested in the sport, because that's how they earn money. Realize that scouting is very intense. There are lots of age levels and large scales, but there's no guarantee of success. Qatar spent 1 billion euros on scouting in Africa over 5 years, but they found no success, and then they completely shut down their scouting program. On our side, private individuals are more willing to absorb the cost because they're in it for the long-term benefits because of all the analysis we gave you before. Communities are more focused on short-term and less risk-tolerant. Corporations can offset costs in the long run, like the English Premier League example I told you, where they're willing to run massive losses in the short term for long-term returns. On our side, sports is more sustainable and it's more effective. This subsumes any value they want to bring because any idea about social outreach, any idea about exploitation can mitigate it, but if they want their value of sport bringing an identity together, it can only exist on our world because sports demands money. Our side gives that money to them. We oppose.
Virtually the entirety of side opposition's case is this. Private owners willing to sink a lot of money into the teams are necessary in order for these teams to be financially solvent. Therefore, teams are allowed to exist, allowing for all the community benefits on our side of the house. We simply do not think that this is true. We tell you that when owners do sink a ton of money into the team, it is not for the express purpose of operating at a loss. And in fact, it is not those individual owners that incur the cost of their teams running at a loss. We tell you it is actually two actors that do that. First, these teams push the cost of their team running a loss onto actual governments by extorting cities for stadium subsidies when they're running a loss, when they're not making enough money, as we tell you on our side of the house. Second, let's just be clear. The debt that these private owners take on, they do not take on themselves. They take on that debt in the name of the team. So when Manchester United, owned by the rich Glazer family, takes on $660 million of debt, they are free to escape that debt by selling off the shares of Manchester United. The team is then left with that debt. These are not benevolent owners willing to take on massive losses in the name of owning a sports team. We don't really think that makes a whole ton of sense. These are owners looking to own, glamorous sports teams and are willing to push all of those costs back onto the community. To them, sports is a business. To us, we think sports are a community public good. Two questions in this speech before I introduce our third substantive argument. First, do communities have a principled right to own sports teams? And second, which side best benefits communities themselves? But first, do communities have a principled right to own sports teams? We told you that sports teams are fundamentally incredibly important to communities and often impose really strong involuntary costs and shape community identity. They told you a few responses to this. They first told you that we have some public goods like electricity owned by private actors. We don't think that's a good thing. We do not think that a private entity should be able, principally, to control all of the electricity in a city without any kind of community or government ownership. But even if you do think that privatization of electricity is a good thing, I don't know the last time that there were marches in the street rallying entire identities along the electrical infrastructure of a country. In contrast, just that last week, as we told you, over 250,000 people in the city of Zagreb rallied around the community sports team as a center point of their identity. We don't think that one fringe billionaire or corporation should be able to control these kinds of dialogues. We'll explain more about this in our third argument as well. Otherwise, if one fringe individual is basically allowed to control the narratives and identities of a city through ownership of a sports team, by doing things like allowing or not allowing African American players in the United States to kneel on the field in protest of police brutality, we think that's incredibly abusive and fundamentally undermines the principles of democracy that we stand for on our side of the house. Furthermore, let's just clarify that when we say cap the number of shares people can own, we mean cap the number of shares that individual community members can own, not cap the number of shares the community as a whole can own. By doing this, we ensure that one rich individual doesn't buy up all the shares, leading to all the problems we talk about on their side of the house. But furthermore, they tell you that local fans are not the most important thing in this round and that global fans matter too. Yeah, we think that FC Barcelona can have many global fans, but we tell you those fans are not the ones that are uprooted when a stadium demolishes their house. They're not the one that that team claims to represent the identities of, and we do think that local fans are the most important. But they furthermore told you fans don't have the right to own these teams because fans are really bad at making decisions, they're super racist, and that enhances rivalries. We told you that to the extent that rivalries exist, say between a Hindu team and a Muslim team, those rivalries are going to exist on either side of the house in a world of public or private ownership. We think that representation of those teams and encouraging more diversity of thought is much more likely on our side of the house when we have a lot of members of the community involved in these sports teams, not literally sometimes one individual or corporation shaping the entire narrative. And we reject the idea that billionaire corporations are way, way better at running sports teams at the point where people like Roman Abramovich, a rich Russian oligarch, literally owns a sports team in the UK for the purpose of hiding money from the Russian government. We really contest this idea. But second, which side is better for communities? The extent of their engagement on this point that we brought up was that private teams are more sustainable, and that was basically their entire response. We don't think this really engaged with this, but we'll address it anyways. We told you, again, at the top of our case, that when these owners do sink a ton of money into the team, it's often not their own money, it's public money, and they don't take on the debt themselves. But we second tell you that actually shareholder sustainability is way, way better on our side of the house, because when people buy shares in a team, it's not a loan to the team that it then has to pay back, it's a direct investment. They told you that not all communities are going to be able to afford this. Well, take the example of AFC Wimbledon, a club in London, where the price of a share is £25 for an adult and £10 for a senior or a student. We don't think this is a ridiculous amount of money to spend. But even so, when fans are really, really dedicated to sports teams and are already taking on a lot of costs to, say, buy tickets and things like that, we don't think that these kinds of costs are ridiculous to take on. And furthermore, 7 out of the 8 most successful teams in the Confederation of African Football, not known for ridiculously wealthy communities, are community owned. So we absolutely think that less funded communities can own sports teams and be very successful. Go.
But why would fans be willing to inject money into the team when the team is stagnating, when they have to prioritize other costs?
We actually think that it is more likely that this is going to be a problem in privatized worlds, because when fans don't have a direct stake in the team by virtue of the fact that they own it, they're less likely to support the team even through bad times. When the team is privately owned, that is actually less likely to happen. We think that people who have already made an investment to the team and have already bought in, as we told you in our argumentation, are more likely to support the team, and it's actually going to be more likely to be successful on our side of the house. We actually tell you that in many cases, privately owned teams that are really, really struggling and almost going bankrupt often convert to community ownership, like with the Green Bay Packers, who were struggling to get by in the 60s and then sold off shares and became one of the most successful teams in the US. Now introducing our third substantive argument about how we better protect teams themselves. This directly engages with a lot of their material. Our first idea under this is that we better the treatment of players and prevent exploitation. To individual and corporate owners, sports players are employees that are there to play the best they can and make them rich. But in contrast to communities, members support players as fans and are much more likely to be interested in their health, their well-being, and other things like that. The comparative is this. Overwhelmingly white owners of sports teams extorting athletes of color, putting them in really physically laborious situations and then casting them aside, versus community-owned teams that actually care about them and are much more likely to protect their own well-being. But furthermore, we think that owners are structurally unrepresentative of communities and teams at the point where it costs millions and millions of dollars to own a sports team. This looks like the 15 richest football owners in the UK, one being a woman. This looks like things like 32 all-white NFL owners telling African-American players, you can't kneel on the field in protest of police brutality or we're going to fine you. We think that's wrong. Our second idea under this is that community ownership ensures teams actually benefit from the financial resources they create. As per our model, community-owned teams are non-profit, meaning 100% of their profit goes back into the team. What does this mean? Both types of team can do things to increase revenue, things like selling tickets, selling merchandise, and getting sponsorship deals. The difference is that on-side opposition, when Arsenal has a sponsorship deal with Emirates, that just makes billionaire owner Stan Kroenke richer. He already has $8.3 billion. We don't think that he needs more. But when Real Madrid has a sponsorship deal with Adidas or Hugo Boss or Microsoft, all of that money goes back into the team, goes back into the community endeavors that they invest in. Even if teams are marginally richer on their side of the house, we think that that money actually goes back into the team on our side. We're very proud to propose.
We think it's incredibly assumptive for Proposition to assume that poor teams will always be able to afford their sport teams just because they're core to their identity. When my first speaker already told you, once healthcare costs go up, once food goes up, sports is the first to go because I'd rather not have a team than not send my kids to school. Ultimately, we think even in their best case, right, and I'm going to engage that in my extension, where teams will always survive and will always be sustainable and that's being incredibly generous for them, it creates large amounts of inequality between teams and in the representation that is harmful. We think ultimately, right, sports needs lots of money and corporations have lots of money. They cannot offer that on their side. Before my extension, I have multiple points of response towards the previous speakers. Firstly, right, they tell you that owners will always be exploitative, and they give us a gross caricature of all owners, simply saying they don't care about their communities, they're awful people, and we shouldn't make them richer. We don't think it analyzed what are the incentives that come with profit, because we don't think profit is such a terrible incentive after all. We think they have to give structural reasons as to why owners will never care, owners are going to be disgusting, and owners will always be abusive. First, sub-level of rebuttal here then. They tell you with regard to community resources, right? We're going to uproot people from their homes, we're going to take people out of school, and we're going to make sure that as owners we can be incredibly abusive. Firstly, we think there's already incentive not to do that. Because if people from that community are always going to hate you because you take away things that are important to them, then you lose your fans. You lose important fan bases that will provide you ticket sales, that will watch your games. In these instances, we think there are already extreme disincentives for that to happen. But B, even in the worst case, we think there are abilities for communities to resist. We don't think owners own all the resources of that community. And in the instance, for example, when the Seattle Supersonics could not provide a team with a stadium that was necessary, the team left. They didn't force anyone to give them a stadium. No thank you. B, they tell you about community involvement. And because the community, they talk about things like ticket prices and the ability for people to exercise, the ability for people to have charities and things like that. Our first response there is, again, there's incentive to do that because you want a growing fan base. But B, even in the worst case, for example, that tickets do rise, I have two responses to that. Firstly, we don't think it's likely because you respond to supply and demand. If to the point that tickets are inaccessible, then you want to lower those prices because you want people to go to your stadium. But B, we think in the point that they do rise, we think that they do not calculate the cost of what a team may mean. So rising ticket prices might mean we have to pay for more player equipment. Rising ticket prices might mean we have to pay for our players' salaries. And if their goal is to be competitive as well, that cannot happen if we have a clouded view as to what that means. But last response under this, they tell you they will have more diversity, ignoring our response. We think on either side, right? We can have racism, we can have discrimination, and that is regrettable. But what are the best disincentives to counter this? Communities can still be racist. We think a team like Chelsea, which hated a lot of their African American players and wanted sacked their Israeli manager, even if he did well, because he was Israeli. But the sole disincentive on our side is capitalism and the ability for you to profit because these players might be skilled, even if you might not be biased against them, because you want to earn money. Chelsea kept their manager. Chelsea kept a lot of their African American players. Second response then on the sustainability of teams. First is on the model. Because if they tell you they can still have money, my question is how? If this is a non-profit, what's the incentive to invest? Are people literally just going to give right out of their pockets with no return on that investment? That's confusing for them. We don't think that's likely to happen because people will always care more about the other needs they have. It is best for a community to offset those costs to a rich billionaire or a rich conglomerate of companies. No thank you. But B, they tell you the money is always going to go back into the team. Firstly, we think with the amount of money we have, there is still incentive for money to go back on the team. Why? Because if you want the team to be successful, you don't keep all of that in your pocket. You want better players. You want better facilities, better medical equipment, better coaches, better stadiums. Because the amount for that profit to increase gets greater the more you put back into that team. Ultimately, we think with the amount of money and resources we have is far more better. No thank you. I want to move on to my extension. Why even if they're always going to have sustainable and sustainable teams, we don't think it is beneficial. Why? I want to examine their best case and show you why it leads to high levels of inequality and little competitiveness. We think that, as my first speaker discussed, there are many costs that members of communities must consider: healthcare, food, transportation, education. We posit that communities have different levels of capacity to account for this. Richer communities will always have the ability, for example, to afford both these essentials and non-essentials like sport. But for poorer communities, when those costs rise, it is incredibly difficult for you to give up sending your kids to school for your team to exist. We think that this creates a disparity in funding between teams dependent on their circumstance. Why is this harmful? In two ways. We think funding is important for the ability for teams to gather talent and competitiveness. The two ways are here. Firstly, with regard to trading and attracting players, with regard to the incentives people have to join a team and the talent they can bring. We think the ability for you to pay higher salaries, larger contracts, means that you always have more tools and capital available to incentivize strong players. We think that is often why in community-owned leagues, for example, Real Madrid and FC Barcelona can afford the Messis and Ronaldos of the world while other teams cannot. We think in the process of negotiation with these players, richer communities will always have the upper hand because they have more leverage. But B, when finding talent through means like scouting that my partner expounded upon, in comparison, right? Scouting is incredibly expensive. You have to look at your younger club division. You have to go out of community and look for more players. The costs are immense, and we think richer communities will likely be more able to afford those costs then. So assuming that both teams will always exist on either side, why is that harmful? No, thank you. We think the purpose of sport is to be able to vicariously celebrate human excellence through sports teams. It is the ability to build solidarity with those teams. Firstly, they have to tell us why that's not possible, because even if national teams, in our worst case, were privately owned, people will still love the Croatian national team because they were excellent. I don't see why public ownership changes any of that. We think, firstly, right, for poor communities, the ability to represent and witness human excellence is harmed. Communities lose interest over time when teams are uncompetitive, when they lose a lot and they're no longer entertaining. We think instead of human excellence, they witness defeat and incompetence, and that is bad for people who are who are burdened by their own circumstance. There's loss of association to those teams if that is your main value. But B, with regard to simple opportunity, we think the opportunities which necessitate good performance, like international cups with qualifiers, like basketball tournaments which need for you to reach the playoff, postseasons that measures high levels of play, you even lose the opportunity to represent because you are chained by the circumstance that is given to you. We think at a league level as well, a large disparity in performance with leagues becomes less competitive, because when you raise that disparity between the rich and poor communities, what happens is that games become predictably boring, because one community can afford all the good players and another team cannot. We think then, if the purpose of sport was to feel excitement, vicariously celebrate human excellence, that can no longer happen when instead, what sports measure are the ability for teams to afford. They measure wealth, riches, and privilege. On our side, however, we think you can equalize that playing field, because you can offset those costs to a rich Pakistani billionaire like the Jacksonville Jaguars did. We think that it is far more equal on our side, because they're not dependent on circumstance. They're dependent on the ability, for example, of rich corporations, and we think even if there's inequality, it is largely much more minimal on our side than in theirs. For these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Had their last speaker deigned to take a POI, we would have asked them if it was likely that the incentives of a profit-driven individual or corporation would necessarily mean that they would reinvest all the money that they garner back into the communities themselves. We challenge the fundamental assumption on the opposition case that private individuals and corporations have the best interests of the communities at heart when, as they pointed out themselves, they operate for profit. I'll analyze this more in my speech when I'll be doing a few things. First, I'll be clarifying framing and going over some mischaracterizations made by the opposition, then attack their third substantive argument, before finally posing two nexus questions when evaluating the round. The first, which side is ahead principally? The second, which side protects teams and by extension, communities? But first, let's talk about the framing. We think, and we told you from the very first proposition speech, that communities' interests are the most important interests to consider in this round. And why do we tell you this is the case? Because we think that the communities are the ones that are most affected by the presence or absence of a sports team. Why do we think this is so important? Because their characterization of private individuals as caring about the team, as caring about the community, is patently false in a world where they are more likely to prioritize their own interests and profit. Why? We think that they're not the ones affected if communities are displaced. They're not affected if communities are extorted. We don't think the private owners are affected if communities are laden with debt, that the private owners are the ones accruing. We think in comparison, it's the communities who have the obligations to protect their own interests that private actors simply don't. We tell you that communities have unique responsibility and relationships with the team and themselves that gives them a vested interest in these concerns. We think that fundamentally the opposition's assertion that private owners are the best placed individuals to run a sports team is incredibly capitalistic. They accuse us of living in a socialist dreamland. They live in a capitalist fantasy. But first, let's talk about their third substantive argument. They say that inequality increases. But let's talk about this idea of inequality. We think on our side, on the comparative, where teams are community-owned, we think we increase equality for a few reasons. First of all, we think the big assumption made by their entire third substantive argument is that really all communities need a sports team. And they basically say that for communities that aren't able to afford a sports team, they can't compete. They can't be equal to other communities that are able to afford them. We don't think that every community needs a sports team. That's something that we told you in the first proposition speech. But second of all, we think that even if, like you say, the community should have a sports team, we think in poorer communities where they aren't likely to invest in shares anyway, they ought to prioritize other things, like promoting public infrastructure investment, like healthcare. They say trade-offs are so harmful, take them at their highest ground. Even if trade-offs do exist because communities have to prioritize their own interests, we still think that principally communities ought to be the ones able to make that choice. If communities are the ones who want to say, well, we want to prioritize healthcare, we want to prioritize investment in education, we want to prioritize like hospital infrastructure or whatnot, we think that they should have the right to make that choice and not be forced to pay more taxes and pay more money that they receive little investment on in return from private individuals just because they might demand more money on a threat to leave the community altogether. We think that at the end of the day, our side is principally ahead, which leads me directly into the first clash point, which side is actually ahead principally. Now they tell you one big principled argument that basically public goods can be owned privately and that capping shares undermines our principle. I'll respond to both of those independently. First, they tell you that public goods can be owned privately. First of all, we think that that's not necessarily true. When they tell you that a lot of utilities are owned by private companies, just like look at water infrastructure, for example. I don't think the city of Zagreb like contracts out like a bunch of water infrastructure to like private companies. They still have oversight and regulation of all this utility infrastructure, so we still think that ownership by communities is still principally just. But even if you do believe that public goods can be privately owned, we still think it's a bad thing for something that's such an important hallmark of a community's identity, for something that imposes involuntary costs on you. Yeah, we think it's important that it be community owned. By extension, what is the analysis that Shreyoshi gives to you that they don't really engage with? We told you that what's unique about sports teams when they're owned by private individuals is that they're more likely to impose involuntary costs on the community. Why? Because it's not like I am asked by Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones in my hometown of Dallas if I want to pay taxes to go towards financing the stadium. He just takes our taxpayer dollars and uses it anyway. We think that you need to have communities in charge of owning the team in order for them to make the tangible decision if they want to pay in the first place. It's the same reason why we have governments regulate taxes. We don't want private individuals imposing all these involuntary costs like taxes on you, so why would we allow private ownership under their world and sports teams when they impose involuntary costs to do the very same? We would not support that. But then, what do we tell you on our side of the house? We don't just tell you that they impose significant involuntary costs, they're a hallmark of social identity. Why is this important? Because what we tell you is that not only is social identity incredibly important and is a reason in and of itself to invest in like community-owned sports teams, we think that honestly increases community buy-in. This leads me into the second clash point on this round, which side protects teams. The biggest argument that they had is that, well, people don't have an incentive to invest in sports teams because people just don't care about it in some cases or do not have the resources to do so. We think that we have two responses. First of all, we think that's factually not true. We think there are a lot of interests that communities have in sports teams. Why? That's the analysis we gave to in our principle as to how sports teams are a hallmark of social identity. We think that at the point where they are a hallmark of social identity and so important to communities, we think like individuals and especially fans who are dedicated to the team are likely to invest in it. Before I go on, I'll take a point.
But if identity is so important, that is contingent on these teams being sustainable. At that point, doesn't your principle become largely reducible to the effects of sustainability?
We don't think that identity is contingent on a team's success or sustainability, but I'll address both of those in this clash point. Let's talk about the idea of team sustainability. They tell you that team sustainability is the most important thing to consider in the round. We gave you 2 responses. First of all, community interest will always trump the interest of the team and the private individual. Why? There are more people in the community. They are the ones who are directly impacted by the social costs. Very easy to respond to. But second reason why we think that team sustainability isn't the most important thing is because we think that community interests oftentimes prioritize the interests of the community in a way that private individuals won't. We think that individuals don't think that the end-all be-all of living in a community is having a sports team to rally around. Yeah, it might be a good thing, but other more basic necessities that communities ought to control and have the decision to trade off with should trump those concerns. But then let's talk about what we tell you on our side of the house. We tell you we increase player diversity and treatment and increase resources to teams. And this is where we want to touch on their idea of teams not being able to finance themselves on our side of the house. We tell you that uniquely on our side of the house, we have the ability to equity finance. And what does that mean? Communities are able to sell shares of stock in order to draw up necessary capital in order to reinvest in the team. That's the comparative that we drew with their side where they talk about private individuals and corporations. They tell you that, well, all these similar financing mechanisms can still exist with sponsorship deals. But the distinction is all the profit that they gain on their side of the house goes to the owner. The only response is, well, the owner can still try and invest in the team, but what incentive do they have to do that? Their interest, as we pointed out, is to invest in themselves and create a bigger profit. But we don't think that they have an incentive to necessarily invest in the team so much as the investors who are already buying shares in their company stock. We think that individuals in the community are more likely to give back to themselves, which brings me into the last idea why we're winning the point about protecting communities. We tell you 2 ideas about preventing extortion and building social capital. Now they say extortion won't happen because it's unpopular. But we think that if it were so unpopular, why would we think that extortion still exists? We think extortion happens because community owners can get away with it. Why? Because they're not the ones who bear the brunt of the cost if they laden communities with a lot of debt. Why? Because we think that in a world where private individuals, like we saw with Manchester United, take on £600 million in debt, why do we think that's such a problem? We think they push those debts onto the consumer, extort the communities for all the money they have, and when the communities aren't able to cough up the money, they just leave and go to other cities. We saw it in Sydney, we saw it even in the United States with Los Angeles. At the point where we think that on our side, we not just principally uphold the purpose of sports and the value of sports, but because we also protect teams and by extension communities, we are proud to propose.
You know what? I'm quite confused. Because if you listen to the case of proposition, on one hand, they say sports is so important to your identity as a community, which is why you need to be able to own it. But on the other hand, they are saying that it's okay if you as a community don't own a sporting team, if you want to prioritize something else. Well, we tell you that communities might want healthcare, might want education, might want whatever kind of benefit that they want to be able for them to be able to have the community prioritize. But they also want a sporting team. They also want to be able to cheer like Zagreb outside the streets when their community performs well. On your side, you make them choose. If it's so important to them, why is that something that you're going to be taking away from them because they do not have any money? We think you harm communities. We think you take away of many other communities' ability to form an identity around sports. We think we're better off coming from our side of the house. We think, no thank you, that their side of the house is still largely unresponsive to the massive costs of sports. We think that because of that, this is something that already causes them to lose. 2 questions I want to answer in today's speech. Firstly, where are we more likely to have a sustainable league? No, thank you. But secondly, where are we more effective in improving things like competitiveness and representation within sports? On to the first question. We have to be very clear. Coming from them, what they say is that there are cases wherein there's extortion, where there is debt, no thank you, where communities have to absorb certain costs. When they didn't respond to any of the responses, no thank you, coming from first and second opposition, where we told you that there is no incentive to be able to do this. Because let's be realistic, right? No thank you. If your fans are so angry, if your fans are outraged that there are unnecessary costs and extortion occurring, then they will not watch your games, they will not buy the jerseys of your players, you will not be able to get TV deals that have people streaming your games all across the community because people are outraged. That's why, no thank you, there is a natural incentive for them to be able to resist these kinds of things. But moreover, we tell you that there are regulations that are in place, right? Leagues, for example, check and balance extortion. Leagues, for example, make sure that no thank you, that these owners are not exploitative. We think that that in many cases, leagues like the NFL, the NBA are able, no thank you, to be able to regulate it. But moreover, if they tell us that these are costs that somehow is offset to the government and to the team in certain circumstances when owners are inherently exploitative, we tell you that given that sports, no thank you, is something that is very expensive, those are costs that you will always have on your side. Even if, no thank you, your community is benevolent, even if your community cares about your team, we tell you that it is unlikely that private owners will do this, but even if they do, these are a minute set of cases, but on your side, because it's very difficult to operate a sporting team, you will always, no thank you, have to incur these kinds of costs. But moreover, if you listen to their analysis, they said this, right? People will give in because they want to be able to keep the team within their community. That they're willing to sacrifice things like healthcare if it means that the team is able to stay. What does it tell you? No thank you. This tells you that the team existing is something that is extremely important to these communities, but on your side, no thank you, you're taking those away, especially when coming from first and second, we told you that it's extremely expensive. It's very difficult for them to be able, no thank you, to be able to offset these kinds of costs. We have to be very clear. When you talk about private owners, when you talk about corporations, you're talking about excess money because they have so much money already that they're willing to funnel into these sports. On your side of the house, no thank you, you're making individuals choose. Which one do we prefer? To have a sport team or to make the kinds of prioritizations you want them to be able to have? We think that it's better off, no thank you, coming from our side of the house. But secondly, they tell us that you want things like accessibility, for instance, that you want ticket prices, no thank you, to stay low. Well, we tell you that ticket prices, for instance, they aren't going to make it insanely high that no one is able to watch it, but we think that there are necessary costs to these ticket prices. No thank you. For instance, with the Green Bay Packers example that they gave you, the stadium of the Green Bay Packers is dilapidated. We don't think that they're able to enjoy their games anyway, no thank you, when some areas of the Green Bay Packers stadium, where some of the boxes don't even have seats for people to sit in anymore. No thank you. We think that these individuals will have a worse experience with sports. We don't think it's better off coming from their side of the house. But lastly, coming from them, they say it's so easy to be able to afford these kinds of things. £25 is not a big deal. They are going to be able to afford it anyway. But you also said that they want to prioritize things like education. So if you don't profit from it, no thank you. They told you you don't profit from funneling your money in. What is your incentive to do that? If I had $25 and I'm like a middle class individual, no thank you. I don't think I'll be spending it on sports, but maybe I'm going to invest in a business that will make my family's lives better. Maybe I'm going to invest on a trust fund for my kid so that individual is able to go to school. But moreover, no thank you, even if they tell you that people are able to afford the £25, you have to understand the structure of community-owned clubs, right? The president needs to have bankable securities. So even if on your side of the house, people have £25 to spend, if you do not have a rich individual in your community, you still cannot own, no thank you, your community team. We think that in terms of sustainability, teams will not exist on your side if you are not Catalonia. You're not going to have it if you're not the capital of your country, if you're not Los Angeles. We think that your teams are going to be worse off. But before I move on to my second issue, sure.
Are profit-motivated sports teams likely to locate in poorer communities that can't do things like buy tickets and merchandise compared to community ownership?
Look, we think that there is an incentive for individuals to invest in small markets because these are niche markets that are not saturated still. Coming from second speaker, we already gave you the example of the Jacksonville Jaguars, where they are a very small community, but the Pakistani billionaire did invest in it and did bring the team, make the team perform well, that they were one game away from the Super Bowl. What did this mean? It means that even if your community are poor, people around the world care about watching you. People around the world will buy the jerseys of your community. And that's how money goes back to the community, that they're going to be able to watch these games and whatever kind of benefit they have coming from our side of the house. Let's move on to the second issue. Where are we better off in preserving competitiveness and sports as a whole? I I didn't give this issue much time because if it was very clear, coming from them, there was barely any engagement. But let's engage with them anyway. What did we tell you coming from first and second speaker? We told you that rich communities are the communities that will be able to afford your LeBron James, your Leo Messi, and whatnot. But if you are poor, you do not have that because already you're dependent on the kind of the amount of shares that you're going to be able to sell, or the price that you're going to be able to sell those kinds of shares. What did they tell you? Simply, they ignored this kind of problem and told you that if you cannot afford it, then you do not have, you no longer want to have these teams exist anyway. Well, we tell you that it harms competitiveness if within the league, the only thing you have are good teams and rich teams when other communities will not be represented. For all these reasons, because we think that everyone deserves a chance to a sporting team, we're very happy to oppose. Thank you.
There were two strategic mistakes that cost side proposition this debate. The first strategic mistake was that instead of proving why structurally their policy is going to work in the majority of instances, they relied on arguments by examples throughout all three speakers. The second strategic mistake is they failed to respond to large amounts of our case and only wanted to consider the worst case scenario. That's why even at third speaker, they were still trying to rebut our first speaker argument without engaging with most of what my second speaker said. I'm going to show this to you in the two issues that came up in this debate. Where is the world more principally legitimate, and where do we protect sports and communities? First, in terms of the principle, the first thing we got coming right at the top of their case was that sports is a public good. But we told you in response that public goods are sometimes privatized because these private companies can provide that good and still make money, sometimes more efficiently. Then their response shifted in second and third speaker to saying it's not just about public versus private, it's about being core to your identity. But if it's so core to your identity, this principle is reducible to how sustainable the team is. Look, this is not about just winning, this is about keeping the team alive at all. So if the team is not alive, you undermine the very core identity you want to protect. This was not responded to. But they misrepresented our case at third speaker. They said they don't care if some teams or some communities don't have teams. We're not saying that communities that on both sides don't have a team right now will always get teams. What we're saying is on their side, some communities who exist in our world that have teams will no longer have the teams at the point at which they're no longer able to have these costs. The last thing they wanted to talk about is demonizing the profit motive. First of all, we gave you several levels of response, why there's a social license to operate, why the point at which the profit is contingent on your fans thinking your team is glamorous, is contingent on fans buying into that culture. That is the point at which there are no incentives. They didn't prove structurally why that exists in the majority of cases. But we also say we allow communities to own teams on our side. That was in our model. But the reason we don't, and the reason why historically many community-owned teams sold it off to private investors, is to keep the team sustainable, which was core to their identity. At that point, they lost the principal debate. Moving on to the second issue about the sports and communities. Two main arguments here. They said they exploit communities through involuntary costs and there's a social outreach problem. We gave you several responses to the involuntary costs. Despite the only things they're giving us were examples, we told you their capacity to resist costs. We gave you the core logic about why this is not a likely thing to happen, even if there are individual instances of abuse. We told you how the Seattle government was able to resist this oppression. We told you how the Minnesota Timberwolves were able to come in even after the Lakers left. That is systemically true. But the response we also gave you coming from the top is on your side, even if communities give the cost, they're always going to shoulder the debt burden. So even in our worst case scenario, it's still better on your side. But note that it was the worst case scenario. There was no engagement with the idea that in the best case scenario in our world, it's much better than in their world because they reduce the competitiveness of teams. But in terms of the response to our several layers of sustainability and several layers of effective, we got two things. People will donate because they like the team and they have sponsors. Well, the first response we gave you, coming from first speaker, is that people will prioritize. The third speaker agreed that people will prioritize things. So if there's rising healthcare costs, if there's a financial recession, only corporate owners will be able to fight these teams. And coming at second and third, they also brought up this idea of sponsors. But we preempted it at first speaker, showing you the difference between sponsors and owners in terms of stimulus money, why sponsors only follow big teams or individual players. No response to like the several layers of analysis coming from first speaker. Lastly, about social outreach. We realized that this case was dropped after first speaker because we effectively rebutted it, saying that there's an incentive to do this social outreach. For example, through youth camps in many countries, scouting and talent attraction that keeps these sports entertaining and keep them sustainable to the core of the identity. But that's only the worst case scenario. There was no response to my second speaker because he said even if everything they said is true, even if sports are always sustainable, we think in that world there is still a problem because when you create this rampant inequality, something that was not responded to, you worsen the ability of teams or communities to associate with that team. We're not saying you have to win. We're not saying you always have to place. But what we're saying is being competitive is what creates the spirit. Being competitive is what created the spirit around the Croatian team. Being competitive is what kept that identity going. We think on our side of the house, not only did we win the principle, but we won the best case scenario scenario on their side, something they were unwilling to engage with on ours. We need lots of money. Corporations give that money. We oppose.
We asked them a POI during their third speech. Are profit-motivated investors likely to locate sports teams in poor communities that can't afford to buy shares and certainly can't afford to buy expensive box seats, merchandise, and tickets and the like? They told us some muddled financial skirty response about how they have incentives to invest in small markets. That did not address the crux of our question. We would tell you that it is incredibly unlikely that profit-motivated sports teams are going to, in fact, locate in these areas in the first place if all of their arguments are true. Two questions in this speech. First, which side creates more sustainable, equal sports teams? Second, which side best improves communities? Let's start with this first question about sustainability and equality. They hang, note, all of their offense on this. They tell you, our sports teams are more sustainable, therefore we get all the community benefits they get on your side of the house. We already told you that it is unlikely that private investors, if their arguments are true, are going to locate sports teams in poor communities in the first place. But we also told you, and this was analysis that was not engaged with, that lower than average income communities do in fact invest in sports teams. We told you that things like shares in AFC Wimbledon are only £25. That is absolutely accessible to these low-income communities. And furthermore, low-income communities can absolutely engage in things like sponsorship deals to get more capital. Note that the Green Bay Packers, one of the most successful football clubs in the United States, has an annual average income $17,000 less than the median in the United States. We told you in the second speech, unengaged with, 7 out of the 8 most successful teams in the Confederation for African Football are in fact community owned. It is absolutely sustainable for a lot of members of the community to take on the massive cost. We don't need one super massively wealthy individual to shoulder these costs. At worst, these teams are moderately less successful and moderately less well off. But we tell you the comparative is this: a world where billionaires control that team and are able to extort those communities for resources. I'll talk more about this in the second question. But we also told you that it is often, from second speech, and this was not engaged with on their side of the house, that it is not often these billionaires who are in fact investing money into teams that they say on their side of the house in a private world often operate at a loss. Those billionaires aren't taking on those costs themselves. They're taking on that debt in the name of that team, and in fact doing things like getting more dollars from the government when things like ticket sales in poorer communities aren't making the money that they need on their side of the house. We tell you that it is much more sustainable. At worst, teams are equally sustainable on both sides of the house. We actually think that teams are less sustainable on their side of the house. That literally takes out every single piece of offense that they have in this round. But now let's move on to what we think is more important in this round. Who is most important for communities? Their response here were all of their sustainability arguments and telling us that owners are benevolent. We told you in the Keel speech that fans often don't pay attention to the bureaucratic mechanisms going on with their teams. And even if they are, often when I grow up watching a sports team, I'm still going to go to games even if a new stadium is displacing a lot of my neighbors. But even if teams do lose support, what are they going to do? Exactly what side opposition tells you that teams do in these instances. They leave communities behind, communities that have invested millions of dollars into this. We tell you, they also told you that we force communities to choose between things like healthcare and supporting the team, meaning that when the community is struggling, it is going to invest in healthcare. Yes, absolutely. We think this is great because the comparative is a billionaire out of touch with the community making that choice for them, extorting governments for more money. We told you in our first speech that there is a power imbalance between these actors at the point where billionaires, often not even from communities, don't have any incentives to see these communities thrive. They just want the best facilities for their players. They just want the most success and wealth for their teams. That is not something that is going to happen on our side of the house at the point where we're willing to sacrifice the quality of some states in the Green Bay Packers Stadium so that we don't see millions of people displaced with their homes demolished. That is what happens on their side of the house. That is why the proposition takes today's round.